Hi, everybody. I'm Michael Kerman with Leading Edge Seminars in Toronto, and happy to welcome you here for this virtual lunch together with Maria Konnikova. Thanks for taking the time to spend with us. If you don't know who we are, we're Leading Edge Seminars who for years, over 25 years, had workshops for mental health professionals in big meeting rooms in Toronto. And then a few months ago, like so many people, we went online. And the virtual lunches are one of the things we've offered along with other kind of webinars and training. So just briefly to tell you what's coming up. Next week is our last virtual lunch of the summer, and again, it's free. And we're going to have another person from New York, Dr. Rachel Yehuda, who's a professor of psychiatry and neuroscience and the director of the traumatic stress studies at Mount Sinai in New York. And she's a recognized leader in the field of traumatic stress studies. And she looks at the field of epigenetics and how genes can be turned on and off through changes in environment and behavior. She studied Holocaust survivors, pregnant women during 9/11, and she's interested in the transmission of trauma through the genes and the effect on the next generation. So she's with us next Tuesday at 1 o'clock, so feel free to join us. You're invited. You just need to sign up for that link. Next month, the reason we're not doing anything is we're preparing a whole new way of working with you, providing training, providing ways to network. It's something I think that's unique in the field, I hope. And next month, we will announce it at some point. So you'll hear more about that later. So for today, first, Emily, who you might see in the screen, this is Emily Porter, she's waving. She's kind of the guru behind the screen, and she'll be taking your questions. So during our program, if you want to put a question in the chat line, or if you have any other issues or questions, you can write Emily, she'll get back to you, and we will be opening up for questions later on in the hour. This is also archived, so if you have to take off or you miss something or you want to hear something again, you're going to get a link in your box, mailbox later today. So I want to introduce Maria to you. So Maria Konnikova, to go back a bit, has a BA in psychology and creative writing from Harvard, and then she went on to get a PhD in psychology from Columbia University in New York. She's the award-winning author of a couple of books, The Confidence Game and Mastermind. And of course, now I'm pretty sure the biggest bluff will be on the bestseller list, if not now and soon. As Amazon said, if you want to get a copy of the book, it talks about how Maria parlayed a strong grasp of the science of human decision-making and a woeful ignorance of cards into a life-changing run as a professional poker player. So Maria has a very interesting story and an interesting life. So Maria, welcome very much to our screen and all our folks. Oops, can't hear you.
There we go. Hi, I'm good. Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here, and thank you to everyone for coming.
So, you know, we have a bunch of therapists watching, and they're always doing assessments of people. So I know you've talked about what led you to write the book and what was going on in your life. And I think that would be especially interesting to the folks watching. So what brought you to The Biggest Bluff?
Absolutely, absolutely. So a few years ago, a lot of bad stuff happened in my life all at once. So near the beginning of that year, it was about 2015, I had some strange autoimmune disorder manifest itself, and I suddenly became allergic to everything. Literally, my skin would just erupt in hives when anything touched it. And I spent weeks just not being able to even leave the apartment because my face, my neck, everything was covered. And it was too painful to move or put on clothes or anything like that. Went to all of the best experts and no one knew what was wrong. So they kept diagnosing me as idiopathic. My hormone levels were all over the place, but no one knew what the actual disease was. In the middle of all of this, my grandmother died. And she'd been perfectly healthy, living by herself, completely independent, and just slipped in the night and hit her head and never ended up waking up. And it was really sudden, and we never had a chance to say goodbye. And that was something that I think did a number on my whole family. And around the same time, multiple family members just lost their jobs. So just one thing after another after another. And it made me just stop for a second and reflect on just how important luck is in our lives and just how much we take it for granted when it's going our way. That every day that everything goes well, it's not like we're waking up in the morning saying, yay, everything is great today, I should be so thankful. We don't normally do that. Instead, we just kind of go on with the day, and we take these things for granted, don't even think twice about them. But when they start going wrong, when your health fails, when people die, when things are not going in your direction, that's when you suddenly realize, oh wow, luck is incredibly important. And I decided that I wanted to write about it, that I wanted to explore the limits of skill, the limits of our own abilities, the limits of our control, and figure out how we could learn to tell the difference between the things that were within us to control and the things that weren't, between skill and chance. And that's not a book, that's a life query. So I needed to figure out a way to make this into a story, make this something I could actually write about. The first step of writing, at least for me, and I think for a lot of writers, and for those for whom it isn't, I think it should be, is reading. Reading a lot of other people's words. And so I dove in. I mean, I had plenty of time on my hands. I was homebound with all of my hives and health problems. So I had lots and lots of days and hours in which to lose myself in books. And so I read everything I could think to read on chance and luck, and inevitably started reading about game theory. So my background is not math at all. I hadn't really had a game theory background in the least. The last math class I took was in high school. So I had never read any of the classics. So I decided, why not go to the beginning? And so I read John von Neumann's Theory of Games and Economic Behavior, which is the foundational text of game theory. I didn't get most of it. It's really complicated and very dry, and I don't recommend it as recreational reading to anyone. But one of the things I learned from it was that John von Neumann, who was one of the great polymaths of the 20th century, not just the father of game theory, the father of the computer, so we wouldn't all be sitting here if it weren't for him, one of the fathers of the hydrogen bomb, so one of the great minds of the century. He was also a poker player, and poker was actually the basis of game theory. And what von Neumann wrote about poker really intrigued me. He said that out of all games, poker was the best model for life, because poker is a game of incomplete information, and that's what life is. You never know everything. There are things I know, there are things you know, there are things we both know, and we need to make the best decisions we possibly can, knowing that we don't know anything, knowing that there's never going to be 100% certainty. That's impossible. That we have to deal with probabilities, we have to deal with uncertainty, we have to deal with unknowns and unknown outcomes, and we have to decide all the same. And so how can we do that? How can we gather information in the best way? How can we put ourselves in a position to get lucky, to be on the right side of the game tree, as von Neumann would put it? And this really intrigued me. I thought, this is fascinating. I should learn more about this poker thing. I should caveat this by saying, I knew nothing about poker before this. I'm not a games player. I don't like games. People are like, oh, you must have played like checkers when you were little. No, I don't know how to play checkers. There were no board games in my house. We didn't have a deck of cards. We read. My parents would read to me. I would read. We didn't even have a television. So we were a books household. And to this day, whenever my niece and nephew take out Catan, I just have this dread in my heart saying, oh no, am I going to have to play this board game? I don't know how I'm going to deal with it. And so I to me, this was very foreign, but I decided this seems interesting. Von Neumann interested me. So I started reading up on this poker thing, and something just clicked. I thought, wow, why doesn't this become the book? Why don't I actually learn to play this game, get someone really good to teach me, and spend a year learning it and use that journey as my way into this subject of skill versus chance, and use poker as exactly what von Neumann intended, as a metaphor for life, to try to explore the limits of our control. And that's how I found myself as a poker player. And one thing led to another, and the book did not turn out as I had thought it was going to turn out. And 1 year turned into many years, and I somehow became a professional poker player. And here we are.
And you're on Poker Stars, and you're known in the poker world.
Yes. So for a little over a year, I was officially sponsored by Poker Stars. I was a member of Team Pro. That happened after I won a major international title. And so I spent a long time on the poker tour. In 2018, I spent over 8 months on the road playing poker. I'm not doing that anymore, obviously. Even without COVID, I wouldn't be doing this anymore. But with COVID, I'm playing zero poker.
Mm-hmm. And one of your mentors you've written about is Eric Seidel, who in a way seems like a poker champ and a bit of a guru. And he said, less certainty, more inquiry. Tell us some of the lessons that you think therapists might learn, people who work with people, if Eric Seidel were to give them advice.
Well, I think you hit on my number one favorite lesson from him. I mean, he has actually a few that I think are quite important for life in general and for mental therapists in particular. But less certainty, more inquiry is one of those things that I feel like it has to be my new life motto. When my book, I was so happy to see this, when my book was reviewed by a writer I really admire. He wrote in his review that people should get this tattooed on their arm, less certainty, more inquiry. And I read that and I thought, yes, you got it. You got my book. Because it's at the heart of the book. What Eric meant by that is that too many people think that there's one answer and that they have the answer, or there's one way to do things. And that is such a limiting approach. And it's not just a limiting approach, it's actually a very bad approach if you want to excel, if you want to improve, if you want to succeed. And what you need to keep in mind is that what poker teaches you is that there's never such a thing as 100%. The human mind wants 100%. We want certainty. We want clear-cut answers. That's how our mind works. Well, it ain't happening. It doesn't exist. And in life, there is literally zero things that are 100% certain. And so you can never say that this is the right way to do anything. And what less certainty, more inquiry forces you to do is always question, always ask why, always stay curious, always be willing to learn, to grow, to change your mind, to realize that you can't just memorize how you're supposed to act in any given situation. Every single time you have to think about it. You have to actually know why you're doing something. You have to reason it out for yourself. In poker, this is really important. And this is something that Eric kept stressing to me, because I was a newbie. I didn't know what I was doing. I wanted him to tell me, how do I play this hand? What do I do here? How do I do this? And it was very much Socratic method. He would say, well, let's think about it. What do you think you should do? Why would you do this? What are the factors? What are the crucial things you need to keep in mind? Why would you do this? Why would you do that? Let's think of the pros and the cons of every single course of action. And it was really frustrating in the moment, because I just wanted him to tell me what to do. But ultimately, he was giving me the skills to think for myself and to be able to survive and thrive without him when I didn't have someone with whom I could talk. And I couldn't revert back to bad mental habits and say, oh, well, this is what I always do here. Because my mental habit was to ask, okay, well, why am I doing this? What are the options? And he made me every single time stop, reflect before acting, and think through all of the possibilities. Think through, okay, I could do this, I could do that. In poker, I can call, I can fold, I can raise, I can do this. But in life, there are always options. There are always different things you can do. There's never one thing that you have to do, even though oftentimes our mind just jumps to it and thinks that, oh, well, I have no choice. There's always a choice, and there are always things that you should do. Taking that moment to reflect and to actually think through all the options in front of you is so powerful in any decision that you make. And it's something that really helps you become a better thinker and be more reflective, be more responsible and responsive and less reactive. It helps you with emotional control, because rather than answering right away, you always take a second to reflect before responding. It helps you not get into bad arguments, because you take that second to just cool down and calm down and think through why you're acting, why you're saying something, what the alternatives are. And one of the things that you also are always doing, because in poker you're playing against other people, you're not just playing in a vacuum, is you're also asking that question about them. So you're thinking, well, why am I acting this way? It has to inherently include the other people in the situation, because you're going to act differently depending on who the other people in your confrontation in your hand are. And so it actually in real life forces you to pay attention to that as well, which we oftentimes don't do. And in poker, unlike in real life, you're forced to learn these lessons. Otherwise, you're literally going to go broke. And that's a very powerful learning mechanism. If your money's on the line, and if you're going to go broke if you don't actually learn and take feedback from the environment, that's a very powerful incentive to learn. And the human brain will learn much better than it will if there are no consequences. So poker is a very good learning environment, because you do get immediate feedback. And as we know, that's crucially important. The other thing, which is different from less certainty, more inquiry, but I think is one of the key lessons of the book, and something that I think is very important to mental health, is something that Eric told me also very early on in my poker journey. It happened after I almost cashed in my first tournament, which was a big thing. I had a wonderful hand, and I thought that I was about to make money finally, after losing money in tournament after tournament after tournament. And someone called me with a worse hand and ended up lucking out and hitting the miracle card that made them win. And I was knocked out of the tournament. In poker terms, this is called a bad beat. When you get your money in as a favorite, when you make all the right decisions, when statistically speaking, you should win most of the time, and you don't, you lose. So it's called a bad beat in poker. So I run to Eric, who's playing in another tournament at the time, and I start telling him this, and I'm about to get to the good part or the bad part when I'm about to lose, and he just shuts me up. He says, "Do you have a question about how you played that hand?" To which I said, "Well, no, I mean," and he said, "Good, I don't want to hear it." And I just, my jaw dropped open, and I thought, you're my coach. You're supposed to listen to me. You're supposed to hear me vent. He said, "No, I don't want to hear it. I want to make a deal with you right now that you will never tell me a bad beat story, because telling a bad beat story is like putting your trash on somebody else's lawn, and it's toxic and it's bad. And why would you just dump your garbage onto someone else? And it's also toxic to you, because if you're focusing on the bad beat, which is the outcome, which is something that you can't control, it's poisoning you. Your mind is actually reflecting on that, as opposed to doing what it should be doing, which is moving on and thinking through the actual thought process. And so we made a deal there, even though I was very mad at him. I thought he should listen to my bad beat story. That he never wanted to know how a poker hand ended, ever. He didn't care if I won or lost. He didn't care what the other person had unless it was relevant. All he cared about were the decision points, was the decision process, how I got there, what the questions were. The outcome didn't matter, because one of the main lessons of poker is that you have to learn to separate process from outcome. We often use outcome as the proxy for, was this a good decision or not? It's not. What we have to focus on is the decision, the quality of the decision. That's what we control. The outcome's going to be what it's going to be. No one can control the cards. And so you have to make the best decision you can with the information you have. And if that was the right decision, then you should keep making that decision over and over and over, even if the results went against you in that moment, because the variance wasn't on your side. That was not a lesson I wanted to learn at the moment, because it's very nice to vent, but it was such a powerful thing for me going forward. It was one of the biggest gifts he could have given me, because it's such an incredible shift in mindset that it helps you improve. It helps you stay focused on the things that you actually are in control of, and then you forget the other stuff, so you move on and you become a much better player because the bad beats don't hang over you. I stopped remembering them. I actually no longer remember how I bust out of any tournament, which means how I lose all my money. I don't remember. My brain just forgets it. And the only thing I remember is, did I make the right decision? The things I remember are the interesting hands, the interesting decisions. And that's bled over into my life. It's a very liberating outcome, because not dwelling on the stuff that goes against you, that's out of your hands, is so powerful for emotional resilience. And it's something that's a difficult lesson to learn, but once you learn it, it's just the most liberating thing there is.
Wow. So do you think, you know, given your background in psychology and this experience, Eric Seidel, you know, I'll make a generalization. You know, a lot of therapy is talking bad beat stories. It can be. Do you think if you were being a therapist, you would be focusing more on the process, or what do you think? Because there is a line of thinking that says people need to tell their stories, and they can tell it over and over again, and sometimes to many therapists. But what do you think about bad beat stories in therapy?
You know, I'm not a therapist, and
No, I
I
know.
want to, no, this is really important. This is something that all of my professors stress to me. I'm a PhD in psychology. I did experimental psych. I study decision making. I'm not qualified to make any clinical judgments,
Okay.
and I should not be. I didn't study clinical psychology. I mean, I know enough psychiatrists and psychologists to know that I shouldn't step into things I don't understand. So I would do more harm than help. So I have my approach, and you know, I'm of like the cognitive behavioral school. I'm very non-Freudian. My advisor was very anti-Freud. So I don't like, you know, that, but that's just my personal opinion. I have no idea what's effective. I'm not a therapist. And so any number of people who are sitting here might sit with me and convince me otherwise. And um, one of the things that I think we need to be really careful of is not to give advice outside of our area of expertise.
Well, thank you for that. I bet you there are a lot of people watching this who'd be happy to weigh in, and it is their area of expertise. So just go back to Columbia, and you studied decision making, and of course the famous marshmallow experiment. Were there insights from your life at Columbia about decision making? You moved into a decision making field in the poker table that were helpful for you.
Oh, absolutely. I think it was a constant feedback loop. I think the fact that I studied what I studied at Columbia helped me ramp up and become a better poker player much more quickly. But I think that poker in turn has made me understand psychology on a deeper level and has helped me actually internalize a lot of the things that I only knew in theory beforehand. And so I think that it's a constant feedback loop. What I think helped from my time at Columbia was, the most important thing was that I had a metacognitive awareness of everything that was going on. I was in there as an outsider. I knew exactly why I was there, and I knew that I was using this in a more metaphorical sense, that poker for me was a laboratory to study the mind, to study decision making. And so I approached both myself and other people at the table that way. And I was able to have this remove that I wouldn't otherwise have had, this emotional remove, a little bit of a psychological remove, which really helped me, I think, be able to identify what was going on. It didn't always help me be able to fight what was going on in terms of some cognitive biases, but at least I had the vocabulary. I was able to kind of figure out what was going on, and then I could work on it, which was immensely helpful. And it helped me through a lot of difficult emotional situations, to be perfectly honest. Poker is 97% male and 3% female. And you can go for days and days and days and never see another woman. And especially early on at the lower stakes, the environment was incredibly sexist and not at all welcoming. And, you know, I was called everything under the sun at the poker table. I was propositioned at the poker table, literally given a room key and told how much money I was going to be paid to go up to someone's room. Like, all of these things happened. If you had told me that it was going to happen, I would have just said, absolutely not. That's impossible. No one would think this was okay. People thought it was okay. And the only way I was able to kind of get through that and keep going was to think to myself, okay, this is awful, but the worse the experience, the better the story. So I tried to channel one of my writing idols, Nora Ephron, and say, everything is copy. Everything is copy. And so I was able to have that sort of psychological remove from the situation, which helped me keep going because I knew I was also chronicling it. Had I just been someone who was there to have a good time, I probably would have gotten up and never come back. And that a lot of people ask me why there are not more women in poker. You've got your answer. Until we change that culture, it's not going to happen. And I think that did come from both studying psychology and specifically, I mean, my advisor was Walter Mischel, who is the marshmallow guy, who's known for his work on self-control and delay of gratification. So one of the things that I worked on for years and years and years was emotional cooling and how to cool your mind and cool your hot emotions in situations that trigger you. And so that came in that was incredibly useful for many periods at the poker table.
Yeah, and you've spoken about emotional resilience now and in other conversations you've had. So is there anything more? I know we've given workshops on resilience. We have someone who'll be watching this from California who writes books on and teaches on resilience, Linda Graham. Other lessons of the kind of things that help get you through those kinds of hard times in terms of your resilience that other people can learn from?
Well, absolutely. And I think part of it is what we were talking about with the no bad beats. I think that the mental frame that you put on something is incredibly important. I wrote a piece a number of years ago, and it was actually one of the most popular pieces I've ever written for the New Yorker that keeps getting circulated over and over on emotional resilience, where I wrote about a lot of the original resilience research that happened in the early part of the 20th century and followed it to a lot of what was happening to the present day. And one of the things you find is just how important it is how someone conceptualizes an event to themselves. One of the main insights of a lot of this research is that an event isn't traumatic until you experience it as traumatic. There's no just inherent, oh, this is traumatic, this is not. That doesn't exist objectively. Everything exists just in the subjective interpretation. And one of the original researchers who studied kids who came from very tough socioeconomic backgrounds and tried to figure out which ones of them ended up doing okay and who didn't, was able to identify a lot of these traits of emotional resilience. And there's one story that really stayed with me that I wrote about in the article, which was about the child who came into school every day with a bread sandwich. So he came from a broken household. His mother was an addict. There was no father. There was never any food, hardly any money. There was bread. And he would every day make himself a bread sandwich, just 2 slices of bread, and bring it in for lunch. And no, people would offer him food. And he said, no, I'm fine. I have my bread sandwich. And he ended up being one of the most successful kids because he said, okay, what can I do? Well, I don't remember how old he was, a 7-year-old kid. He can't cook anything for himself, 6 years old. He brings himself a bread sandwich and he makes it for himself every day. And that's kind of in him to control. And he ends up succeeding because he kind of takes that. He says, okay, all these bad things are happening, but this is what I can do. I don't need help. I can do this. And that kid ended up making a huge impression on me, on this researcher, and is a great example of how internal construals can actually help you be either more or less emotionally resilient. Now, some of the work that I did at Columbia was on internal versus external locus of control, which is Julian Rotter's work from the 1950s and 60s. And I'm sure that everyone here is familiar with it, but just very briefly, it means, where do you think control resides? Internally, you control events, or externally, things happen to you. And it's much, and some things obviously have an external locus, some internal, but the way that you describe things to yourself, it can really affect how you experience events. And this was really reinforced when I was playing poker. There was one specific tournament where in the middle of the tournament, and during tournaments, I often will text with Eric, my coach, and send him hands, send him kind of what's going on so that he's aware, and so that we have notes to go over for the future. And he came to me during a break, and he said, I'm really worried about you. I'm worried about your thinking. You're describing things as happening to you. You're not actually, and he didn't know anything about internal, external locus of control. This is a guy who's been a professional poker player his entire life. He never finished college and is one of the smartest people I've ever met. But he hadn't read any of that research. And so, but he just nailed it. He said, you're describing everything as happening to you. You're saying, oh man, like my aces got cracked. Oh, I got so unlucky. This happened, that happened. He said, you're describing everything right now as happening to you and not as you actually making decisions and taking active control and actions. And I'm worried about you. You're not playing well. You need to reset. And he was so right. And he actually, hearing him say that, hearing him identify that, made me realize that I had defaulted to this very external locus, like, oh man, I'm getting so unlucky. I'm getting such bad cards. This is happening. That guy's such a bully. I'm at such a horrible table. That's a really, really bad frame of mind. And that's a frame of mind that's not conducive to good thinking. That's not conducive to good emotional reactions. That's not conducive to improving and to playing well, to doing well. All of this can be taken out of the poker context. So that's something that poker really hit home, really brought home to me. And it made me realize how often we do that without realizing it. And oftentimes you need someone to point it out. And once they do, and once you start noticing those thought patterns in yourself, you can start working on changing them. Every time you start thinking that, oh, everything's happening to me, poor me, I'm so unlucky, reframe it, and actually think about it from a more internal, positive frame of mind, because you always can.
Well, that's very helpful for everyone and people who work with others who don't have a strong internal locus of control, for sure. I'll ask you a couple more questions and then we'll open it up for everyone who's watching. You can come on the screen. Just put on the chat line, the chat box you'd like to ask a question, and Emily will get you to the screen, hopefully as many of you as possible. But just going back to your previous books and what therapists can learn. You studied Sherlock Holmes and you talked about the Watsonian mode and the Holmesian mode of understanding life and maybe helping to solve mysteries. Briefly, any ideas from there that you think would be helpful to therapists?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, the book, even though it was about Sherlock Holmes, all my books are about one thing and then at its heart about something else, or at least that's how they're intended. Right. And this one was about mindfulness. And this was before mindfulness was a buzzword. No one knew what it was. And so my way of bringing mindfulness to the public consciousness was through Sherlock Holmes and Watson, as a contrast between mindfulness and mindlessness. Watson, clearly an incredibly successful, I know they're both fictional characters, so bear with me. An incredibly successful individual, a doctor, and yet someone who was definitely not present, not mindful, didn't go through life in a very present way. Those two things are not at all incompatible. You can be very successful and not someone who is very good at paying attention. And then you have Holmes and the Holmesian approach, which is much more mindful and present and deliberate. And the difference to me is summed up by the scene where Holmes asks Watson how many steps lead up to 221B Baker Street. Watson doesn't know, and Holmes says, well, that's the difference between us. You only see, I both see and observe. That's really the heart of my book, the difference between seeing and both seeing and observing. Seeing and observing is hard. It takes effort. It takes energy. you have to make a conscious choice to be present, not to multitask, to actually pay attention to what's going on in any given moment. And the human brain isn't made for that. We're actually, our default mode is the Watsonian mode, the more mindless mode, because that's what our brains do. They drift and they're all over the place. And the modern environment is a perfect storm for them, because there's always something that's there for you to pay attention to or not to pay attention to, always something vying for your mind's eye. And so you end up not paying attention to anything, and you oftentimes become bored, because boredom doesn't come from lack of stimulation. Boredom comes from lack of focus, from lack of engagement. And when you have a million things coming at you, it's really hard to engage with any one thing, and it comes with a deep sense of unfulfillment. And so I think that that's one of the main lessons from this book for mental health, which is that, you know, mindfulness is tough, but it leads to so many good things, and so many not just better habits of thought that will make you more like Holmes in terms of your thinking, but it actually makes the world more interesting, because if you get into the habit of paying attention, you notice more things, you engage with more things, and you suddenly find that it's not so hard, and that you are able to actually engage and to really be present. And I'll just say one more thing, which is that in the last few months, a lot of people have asked me if I'm able to read, because with COVID and with everything going on, a lot of people say, I can't finish a book. You know, I can't focus. There's just so much going on that I find myself unable to finish anything and to do anything. And I think that a lot of that comes from just being constantly on social media and constantly following the news and constantly just looking at everything that's going on. And so my advice, which actually comes from my first book, is to step away and unplug, and to actually realize that the world is probably not going to end because you turned off the TV and turned off your computer for a few hours. And I mean, the other practical thing that I tell people who are struggling to pay attention is try poetry. I think that poetry is something that's gotten me through a lot, and it's oftentimes shorter. And I think that it's a beautiful way to get back into the habit of reading.
That's great. You know, I have more questions, but I think I want to open it up. We have about 20 minutes left. So if you have a question, Emily, do we have any in the chat line?
We're starting to get a few in. Christina Walton had a comment, and then I believe she was going to add a question. Christina, are you there?
I'm here. Hi, can you hear me?
Yes. Yes.
Okay, awesome. Sorry. That was really cool. I like the idea of poker kind of showing life. I work with a lot of people who have the bad beat happen. I work with grieving people. So for me, and I guess this is just more of a general comment, it's around finding that balance that, yes, the bad beat happened. We can't minimize it. We can't take it away. And now that this has happened, what is the story you're telling yourself, right? And then finding a balance of making your own decisions now that that bad beat has happened. So the bad beat, I think, stays a bit more present than like a bad hand in poker. But I love the simplicity of your model and all of the implications. I'm just wondering if you have any thoughts around kind of bad beats that we can't.
That's such a good question. And I was actually just giving an interview before this event where someone had asked me about, you know, there's a portion of my book about, which is different from the bad beats, about learning from failure and learning from loss. They're like, well, everyone's experiencing loss right now. And I was like, no, that wasn't actually my point, because there's two different types of loss. There's the loss that comes from a bad decision that you made, which you can absolutely learn from, and then you can learn to have a better decision process. There's the loss that comes despite a good decision that you made, and you can also learn from that, and you can kind of move on. And then there are the losses that happen because of the noise of the universe, and death is part of that. It's not something you did. unless you actually caused someone to die, this is not something that's part of your decision. It happened. And in poker, that doesn't happen, right? So poker is a game. So ultimately, poker is a great way for, as you say, for more simple frameworks that we can start with and try to expand. And yet, normally nobody dies. And there's a bottom to the loss. And I think that in real life, you can't just have the Eric approach, I don't want to hear about it, because some of the bad beats happen, just they're devastating, and they're not quite as simple as that. And so I think that we need to actually learn to separate the two, learn to separate kind of the types of things that happen because or in spite of your own actions, and then the things that just happen because life happens. That is just kind of a part of life. And the latter ones, I think, are important to talk about. But then you can use some of the lessons from the former. Okay, how do we reframe? How do we eventually move on after talking about it? Yes. But you do realize that some of those things, the life bad beats are things that you should talk about. It's healthy to talk about them, but then we have such a great framework from the other types of bad beats that we can then use to help us, I think, deal with them and eventually move on. And that doesn't mean, I think the other main difference is, I said I forget the bad beats in poker, which is wonderful. I think that the small bad beats we should forget, because you know what? Life's going to give you enough big bad beats that if your mind is dwelling on all the small ones, you're just going to be, you're not going to be able to deal. So clear your mind of those. But of course, the other ones you don't want to forget, and you want to use them and use them as part of your growth process going forward. So I think it's a balance, and it's what I was talking about before, kind of this cycle where you take some lessons from one part, bring it to the other, and then the other part help make the other part stronger. So it's definitely a back and forth. It's not just a one-way street.
Thank you. Thank you.
Emily?
Emily, we can't hear you.
Silly mute button. So we had a question from someone who can't ask her question. She doesn't have a microphone, but she was asking about how do you respond to the idea that bad beats happen systematically to certain people or groups more than others. So so for example, people who are Black or Indigenous, how should those people respond to systemic problems which are not due to chance?
Right. So that's actually not a bad beat. Right. That is against the definition of a bad beat. A bad beat is getting your money in as a favorite and then losing despite it all. One of the main reasons I wrote my book is to make people realize that that luck plays a huge, huge, huge part in life, starting from second one, being born. Who were you born as? First of all, everyone who was born got lucky, because most people are never born. So I have a part of my book is a reflection on this. But after that, where were you born? Who are your parents? What were your genes? Where are you growing up? Life is not fair. And people who say, one of the main things that I wanted to get at, I know most of you are from Canada, but my book is a very anti-American dream. I think that is total bullshit. And I think it's a very, very pernicious way of thinking, because it makes it seem like people who aren't successful didn't work hard enough. Because if you only work hard enough, you can succeed and attain the American dream. Bullshit. That's not true at all, because we don't live in a world like that. And so there's no such thing as a meritocracy. It just doesn't exist. And unfortunately, that's the world we live in. That's completely separate from bad beats. Like, bad beats is a totally different concept. And so my book is about that, and about understanding that, and about trying to do our best to work with what we have, but also understand that I hope that everyone is appreciative. Someone like me, for instance, made me so incredibly appreciative of just how damn lucky I am. Yeah, sure, I've had problems. I know people who've died, but I was born in the Soviet Union as a Jew. That wasn't ideal, but I was born with my genes to my parents who knew it wasn't ideal and who got me the hell out of there. Had I stayed in the Soviet Union, I wouldn't be a writer, because the country was and still is incredibly anti-Semitic. But before, there were actual quotas. Like, you couldn't get into colleges and do a lot of things because you were Jewish. And I'm so lucky, and that has nothing to do with me. That was just my parents. You know, that's none of my own skill. That I can take zero credit for that. And a lot of things happen like that have put me in the position I am right now. And I'm sure there are people who've worked just as hard, and some have worked much harder, who didn't get there. And that's something that I think we all have to understand, and then do our best to try to change those systemic things, because that's what we can control. If we're going back to kind of some of the earlier lessons that I was talking about, focus on what you can control, not what you can't. Well, we can control how we respond. We can control what we do. We can control through elections, through donations, through the voices we amplify, through the things we choose to say and choose to do. We can chip away and start trying to make the world better, but it's going to be a huge uphill battle, and it's not easy. And I think that those of us who are lucky enough to be in that position should use that luck, and try to spread it to other people. And most importantly, I think one of the things that poker has taught me, that kind of this experience has taught me, is that you can't judge other people. It really teaches you to not be judgmental, because you have no idea where people are coming from, what they've had to get over, where they're coming from. To think that you know someone just because you've seen them or heard something about them is very short-sighted. And so a lot of times we're quick to say, oh, you know, this person was lazy, this person is this person is that. How do you know? So I think that it forces you to stop and say, well, how lucky was this person? How lucky was I? And realize that so much about our life outcomes is not because of what we did, but because of things that have nothing to do with us. Sorry, I went on a little bit.
No, they're such important topics to be discussing. Our next question comes from Hannah Rockman. Hannah, are you there?
Yep.
Hannah? Hi.
Hi. Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, go ahead.
Oh, my question really was just when you were talking about bad beats and how we shouldn't really encourage clients to sort of discuss the outcome so much, but rather the decision making about them. But then, you know, how, I'm not quite sure, might help if you gave an example, but because I'm not quite sure because clients might then go, the bad beats might be their decisions, right? So they might say, well, yeah, I made a bad decision here, and if I hadn't have done that, this wouldn't have happened. And so then it becomes about how they can't make decisions, and how, so then that becomes their recurring sort of story. So I'm not exactly sure what you mean by that.
So that's very different. So once again, bad beats are when you made the right decision, but you had a bad outcome. You did the right thing. You probabilistically got your money in as the favorite, so to speak, but the outcome went against you, because there's no such thing as getting your money in as 100% favorite. If you get your money in, and by the way, when I say get your money in, just think of life, don't think of poker. Like, when you make the decision, if you get your money in as a 75% favorite, you should do that again every single time, over and over and over. But you know what's going to happen? 25% of the time you're going to lose. And probability is not normally distributed and doesn't care what happened last time. And you might get stuck in that 25% for years. You have no idea when the long run is actually going to play out. In the short term, there's no memory. Probabilities are only probabilities and only even out over the long run, but nobody knows what the long run is, right? So you need to make sure that you get over the short run. If you are questioning your decision process, that has nothing to do. So bad beats are all about outcome. They're not about process. So questioning your decision process is what you should be doing. You should actually be asking, am I making the right decisions? Am I thinking well? Am I thinking clearly? That should be what you're focusing on. That should actually be what you're talking about. What Eric told me is, did you have a question about how you played your hand? Did you have a question about the decision process? And if yes, then let's talk about it. Let's discuss it, because we need to make sure you're thinking well. We need to make sure you're thinking clearly. As long as you're doing that, then who cares what the outcome was? Because if you think clearly, if you learn to be someone who makes good decisions, who's able to analyze your decision process, who's able to correct the things that are wrong with your decision process over and over and over, then eventually you'll win. Because eventually, in the long term, if you keep getting your money in as a favorite, then the right outcome will happen. So that's, I think it's two very separate things, and you should be talking about decision process.
Okay, thank you.
Of course.
Thank you. And next we have Ian McFigure. Ian, are you there? Oh, sorry. Ian, can you unmute? There we go.
Hi, sorry about that.
Hi, Ian.
For Maria, I use your books both in teaching decision-making and intelligence analysis, and I'm also a yoga mindfulness teacher.
Oh.
Great ideas today. My question is this. I use the mental first aid mantra on myself and for my students of I am thinking that, fill in the blank, to flip the person from thinking mind, where you got the monkey chatter, into observing mind, where you're more like Sherlock Holmes. Now, I picked up some of your more long-term ideas and how to lead yourself or your student to be that way. But do you have any other mental first aid tricks or little axioms you use to help people get through things in the short term?
Well, one of the things that I use most frequently, and it's, so I think it depends on the person, right? Because everyone has different problems and different issues that are confronting them. And so, yeah, I have a mantra that I actually use on myself all the time, which I took from another writer, Anne Lamott, who tells this wonderful story. So if you guys haven't read her book, Bird by Bird, I highly recommend it. It's one of the best books about writing that I've ever read. And she tells a story about her younger brother when she was growing up. And he had this huge bird report due. And he'd had several months to work on it, and he hadn't. And he was sitting at the kitchen table, and the report was due the next morning. And he started crying and said, I don't know how to do this. You know, how am I ever going to finish? I'm doomed. I'm going to fail. And her dad, who was also a writer, sat down next to him and said, bird by bird, buddy, just take it bird by bird. And it's something that I say to myself so many times whenever I'm feeling overwhelmed and stressed and like there's too much going on, be it, you know, I have too many things to do, or there's too many thoughts in my mind, or too much that I need to get a handle on, too many emotions, too much this, too much that. I take a deep breath and I close my eyes and I say, bird by bird, just take it bird by bird. And it's so, I mean, I don't know if it will work as well for other people, but to me, it's so calming and so powerful because it's such an important lesson. Just one thing at a time, focus on one bird at a time, because looking at all the birds is way too overwhelming. And I think it's also the heart of mindfulness, right? You want to take everything bird by bird, and it's a way to make yourself better. So thank you, Anne Lamott, and I hope that helps some of your students.
I'll show you spasiba.
Пожалуйста.
Thank you, Ian. Catherine has a question but doesn't have a mic. So she's a poker player, a therapist, and she loves your books. She mentioned that you talked about experiencing anger at the female social conditions that made aggression more difficult in poker. And she was wondering if you did any exploration at how attitudes to females and aggression affect the way women stand up for themselves, and how this might present in a therapeutic environment.
Yeah, so the research I did, which it's very funny, happened before my foray into poker, which is why I thought that I'd be immune to it, because I knew all these biases existed, and I knew that women were penalized for aggression, and yet I internalized these things anyway, and I found it hard to be aggressive. And it ends up that social norms and the way that society views us are much more difficult to overcome than you think, even if you're a psychologist who's done research on this and who's studied it. It's really hard not to internalize it, and you end up acting in a way that confirms with social expectation, and that's really depressing. And it was very difficult for me to acknowledge that about myself, and I've been working very, very hard to get over that, and I think poker really helped me. But yeah, unfortunately, the things that you learn is that aggression is punished in females, and that in the same traits that are seen positively in men are seen negatively in women, and that negotiating while female is incredibly dangerous, and that you do need to actually do things differently because you will get penalized just for being a woman. There's a story that I found when I was researching this and writing this big piece on being female and on the dangers of leaning in, when I was writing for the New Yorker. And the story was about a young philosophy professor who was offered a tenure track offer at a small liberal arts college in upstate New York, and which is, which doesn't happen. There's no one hires in philosophy. This was amazing. And she was ecstatic, and she'd written an email asking for clarification about some of the terms of her job offer. So she wasn't even negotiating so much as saying, oh, like, what about maternity, can you clarify the maternity leave? What about this? What about that? And in response, her offer was taken away. So they wrote back and said, oh, it seems like you're actually not going to be a good cultural fit for our institution. We're rescinding the offer. What kind of a lesson does that teach? I mean, can you imagine that happening to a man? I can't. And it was really horrifying to see her go through that. And that's the unfortunate reality. And I think we are doing ourselves a disservice if we don't acknowledge that, because we need to have women in positions of leadership, and this is another thing where we, unless things change from the top and the tone changes from the top and we start seeing social changes and changes in social norms, then people are going to get their job offers taken away. So I think that one of the things that poker eventually taught me was how to be aggressive in a smart way, in a way that fit me, in a way that I could still be successful outside of the poker table. I think it has made me much more confident and a much stronger female, because it's taught me to stand up to bullies. I think that's a very important thing, and to assert myself. And I learned a lot from the guys who are always so damn confident, because we live in a man's world, and poker is really a man's world. I mean, like I said, 97% male. And they teach you a really important lesson. There's a huge difference between looking confident and actually being strong. There are guys who are really, really good at looking like they're, king of the world, no matter what. You can take a lesson from that and say, oh, wow, no one can see his cards. We just assume he's strong because of how he's acting and how he's carrying himself and how he's bullying other people. But he might actually be incredibly weak. And spotting that and actually being able to say, hey, you're weak, and calling someone down and forcing them to show you just how weak they were is very empowering, because you realize how often that happens in real life, and how many times you've probably been bluffed. And that's realizing that is step one to avoiding it in the future. So I would love to live in a world where I could be that, and I could be aggressive and get away with it. I don't, but at least I'm better able to stand up to the other people, to spot the things that say that maybe they're weak, and to find my own style of aggression that works better. I think we have time for one more question, and then I unfortunately have to go.
No. Yeah, sorry, Michael.
If we can keep it quick, I know Maria has an engagement just in a few minutes, so one more quick question, then we'll have our goodbye.
So Claude had a question that said, the way you describe poker reminds me of the description of mentalization. And he was wondering what your thoughts were on that.
Sure. I mean, I think that there are, to give you a very quick answer, yeah, I think that there are lots of lots of parallels, and I think that that's something worth exploring. I'm sorry it's 1:59 and I don't have a chance to go into that. That's a deep question. But yes, that's a great start, and I think I would love to talk about it more.
Hey, Marie, we have a little tradition. I know you have to go in a minute, but we ask everyone to say thank you and goodbye to all our guests. So I want to say thank you. We'll open up all the microphones, put on your cameras, and I'll say goodbye, and everyone else can say goodbye. Have a great day.
Thanks.
So much. It was such an honor. Goodbye.
Thank you, everyone.
Love you all.